Ever get that like super weird feeling? You're just doing something normal, maybe chatting with someone or walking into a room, and bam, it hits you, this really intense feeling like you've already lived this exact moment before.
Yeah.
Even though, like, logically, you haven't.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it, that feeling of déjà vu. It's one of those kind of universal quirks of being human.
It's so strange. And you've sent over a bunch of articles and studies on this, which honestly just made me even more curious about what's happening in our brains when we get that feeling. It's like the French term literally means already seen.
Hey, you got it. Déjà vu, straight from French, means already seen. And it's pretty remarkable how many people actually experience this. Some research even suggests that, get this, like 60, maybe even as high as 97% of people will have at least one déjà vu moment in their lifetime. And a good chunk of people experience it pretty regularly.
Wow, that's a huge number. Makes you feel a little less, crazy when it happens to you, right? I mean, this isn't something new, is it? People have been talking about this for ages.
Oh, absolutely. We can even find mentions of it way back, like around 400 AD with St. Augustine. He talked about something called false memoriae, which basically means false memories. But the actual term déjà vu, that didn't come about until 1890. A French philosopher named Émile Boirac coined that term. And not too long after, a neurologist named F.L. Arnaud started using it in a, more scientific context.
That's interesting. So what were some of the first thoughts on what caused déjà vu? Was it always seen as this kind of weird brain thing?
Well, at first, there was actually some thought that it could be linked to diagnosing epilepsy. But, as we've learned more about the brain through research, the thinking has shifted. It seems like it's probably more connected to how our brains handle perception, or maybe even how our memory works.
Makes sense. So let's dive into some of this, right? That's what we're here for, after all.
Yeah.
You've sent over these really interesting sources, and we're going to deep dive into what we currently understand about déjà vu. We want to explore all the different theories out there and what they might mean without getting too bogged down in, super technical details.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe a good place to start is with this idea of a brain glitch.
A glitch, huh? I like that. Kind of makes me think of my computer acting up. What's the main idea behind this theory?
Well, basically, it suggests that two different streams of awareness are kind of like colliding in your brain for a split second. So you have your current experience happening right now, but then suddenly you also have this feeling that you're remembering it, but incorrect. The important thing here is that you're aware, at least on some level, that you haven't actually been in this exact situation before.
So it's almost like my brain tries to pull up a memory that's not really there, and then like the more logical part of my brain steps in and goes, wait a minute, something's not right here.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And there's actually a specific idea within this glitch theory called split perception. Imagine you see something very briefly. Maybe you're distracted or your view is blocked for a second. Your brain still picks up that first glimpse, but maybe not fully. Then, just a fraction of a second later, you see it clearly. That second clear perception can feel strangely familiar because, well, your brain did already process it, even if it was incomplete. You weren't fully aware of that first moment, so the second one can kind of trick you into thinking you've seen it before somewhere else.
I think I get it. It's like if I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye and then I turn my head to really look at it, that second look could feel like, oh, I've seen this before, even though I haven't.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, your sources also talked about how there are different types of déjà vu. Like it's not just that one already seen feeling. It gets more, nuanced than that, doesn't it?
Right. Definitely. While all of these déjà experiences share that feeling of familiarity, it seems like there might be different things going on in the brain depending on whether you're talking about, say, a healthy person having déjà vu versus someone with a neurological condition.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are you saying like different parts of the brain are involved?
Could be. For example, they've found that people who say they experience déjà vu more often tend to have a little less gray matter in their brain.
Less gray matter. Remind me, what's gray matter again?
So gray matter, it's that outer layer of the brain. It's like super important for stuff like, movement, memory, and emotions. All the good stuff.
Right. Okay. So what's the connection there with less gray matter and déjà vu?
Well, one idea is that a brain with a bit less gray matter might not be quite as efficient in, processing information. So maybe that slight inefficiency in how things get processed contributes to these, fleeting feelings of familiarity popping up out of nowhere. And then you have these neurological conditions like schizophrenia, epilepsy, anxiety, or even vascular dementia. These can often affect specific parts of the brain that are crucial for memory.
So, if those parts of the brain aren't working quite right, that could mess with memory and cause déjà vu.
Yeah, it's a possibility. We're talking about areas like the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus, hippocampus and the temporal neocortex. These are like the heavy hitters when it comes to forming and storing memory.
Okay, so damage to those areas could maybe explain déjà vu in people with those conditions. But what about people who don't have those conditions, who just have, like, normal déjà vu?
Right. So they've looked at the brains of people with epilepsy who experience déjà vu, and they've actually seen some changes in the memory circuits there. But here's the interesting part. In people who are healthy and have déjà vu, the changes seem to be more in the areas of the brain that deal with emotions.
It is interesting. So it's not just about memory then. There's an emotional component too.
Seems that way. They think déjà vu might involve some weird signaling going on in the medial temporal lobe. This part of the brain is really important for processing memories, especially visual ones, and it's also connected to emotional processing.
Okay, so it's more complicated than just a simple glitch then. You have these different parts of the brain, different types of brain activity, maybe even emotions playing a role.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex picture.
Now, you also mentioned this whole range of déjà experiences going beyond just vu or seen. I was actually kind of surprised by how many there are.
It's quite a list. Déjà vu, that feeling of already seen, is the one everyone knows, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's déjà entendu, which is already heard. Then there's déjà éprouvé, which is more like a general feeling of having already experienced something, a sense of familiarity with the whole situation. And there's déjà fait, the feeling of having already done something. And déjà pensé, that weird feeling of having already thought something. You can even have déjà raconté, like you've already told a story before, even though you haven't.
Wow, there are so many I never even realized.
And there are even more. Déjà senti is like feeling a particular emotion or even smelling a certain smell and feeling like you've smelled it before. Déjà su is that weird feeling of knowing something that's happening, like you already knew it was going to happen. Then you have déjà trouvé, like you've already found something. And déjà vécu is a really intense one. It's like you've already lived through the present.
It's mind-blowing.
Right, and there's déjà vu, like you've already wanted something that's now happening. Then there's déjà rêvé, feeling like you've dreamt something that you're now experiencing in real life. And even déjà visité, the feeling of having already been to a place, even though you know you haven't.
That's incredible. It really makes you wonder if these are all just like slightly different versions of the same thing happening in the brain, or if they're completely separate things altogether.
That's a great question. And speaking of opposites, there's also jamais vu.
Oh yeah, you mentioned that earlier. So that's when something totally familiar suddenly feels new and strange. Like you've never seen it before, even though you have.
Exactly. Jamais vu means never seen. It's that creepy feeling when a familiar situation or even someone you know really well or a word you use all the time suddenly feels totally foreign and unfamiliar. It's kind of like the flip side of déjà vu.
It is pretty trippy. So with all these different déjà experiences and all these potential brain areas and activities involved, what actually triggers that déjà vu feeling in the first place?
Right.
The sources you sent mentioned some pretty interesting possibilities.
Yeah, there are a bunch of ideas out there. One of the most common ones is that it's linked to stress and feeling tired. People who are stressed out or exhausted often say they have more déjà vu experiences. The thinking is that stress and fatigue can mess with both short-term and long-term memory, which could lead to these weird feelings of like mismatch between what's happening now and what you think happened.
Right. When I'm super tired, my brain definitely doesn't feel like it's working at its best. What about dopamine? Didn't some of the sources mention something about that?
Yeah, they did. There's this theory that high levels of dopamine might be involved. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's important for a ton of stuff in the brain, including memory and reward. They've done studies with rats that have temporal lobe epilepsy, and they found that dopamine activity is increased in those rats. There's also this pretty interesting case where a healthy person was taking some flu meds, amantadine and phenylpropanolamine, and they started having tons of déjà vu moments, like multiple times an hour. But as soon as they stopped taking the meds, the déjà vu went away. Both of those drugs can affect the dopamine system, so that suggests maybe too much dopamine could trigger these feelings.
That's a pretty strong link. It's crazy how these seemingly random things could give us clues about what's going on in the brain. Speaking of clues, memory seems like a really key part of this whole déjà vu puzzle. What are some of the memory-based explanations that have been proposed?
Well, research has shown that people who have déjà vu actually tend to have pretty good memories overall, especially what we call long-term implicit memory. That's the memory for stuff like skills and habits that you don't have to consciously think about. So the idea is that maybe our recognition memory, our ability to recognize things we've encountered before, is getting triggered when it shouldn't be. Maybe there's some tiny similarity between what's happening now and a memory trace that's already in our brains, or maybe there's not even a real memory, but just enough of a shadow of a memory to create that feeling. So it's possible that déjà vu is actually a side effect of having a really healthy and active memory, a memory system that's always trying to find patterns and make connections, even when there aren't any.
Oh, so it's like my brain is picking up these faint echoes of past experiences, even if I can't actually remember those experiences.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And they've even done experiments where they use hypnosis to make people forget things or make them feel familiar with things they've never. And when those people encounter those things later on, some of them report feeling like they're having déjà vu. This really highlights how closely tied memory is to this whole phenomenon. Researchers also talk about the difference between recollection-based recognition and familiarity-based. Recollection-based is when you actually remember specific details about something that happened in the past. Familiarity-based is when you just have that feeling of knowing, but you don't have any specific memories to go with. It seems like déjà vu might be more connected to this familiarity-based recognition going haywire.
That makes sense. And you mentioned earlier something about studies using virtual reality. How does VR fit into all of this?
Oh, yeah. So there's been some really interesting research with VR. They've found that if the layout of a virtual environment is similar to a place you've been before, but you don't consciously remember it, you might get that feeling of déjà vu. So even if you can't remember the actual place, that unconscious memory of how the space was laid out can make you feel familiar with this new virtual place.
So it's not necessarily about the specific things in the environment, but more about the overall spatial arrangement.
Yeah, exactly. And there was this fMRI study in 2018 where they actually looked at brain activity during induced déjà vu. They were able to trigger these feelings in people by showing them lists of words, some related, some not, and then asking them about words that hadn't actually been on the list. And what they found was that during those induced déjà vu moments, there was more activity in the parts of the brain that deal with mnemonic conflict.
Mnemonic conflict. What's that?
It's like when your brain's memory system detects a mismatch or a contradiction in the information it's processing. So basically, your brain is going, hey, this feels familiar, but why? And that triggers that feeling of déjà vu. This, again, points to memory being a big part of the experience. And then there's this other idea called cryptomnesia.
Cryptomnesia.
It's basically when you've totally forgotten that you learned something, but then later on, that information pops up and it feels like it's your own original thought.
That happens to me all the time. Like when I suddenly know the answer to something, but I have no idea where I learned it.
Yeah, exactly. So that could potentially be related to déjà vu, too. Maybe sometimes that feeling of familiarity comes from these forgotten bits of knowledge resurfacing.
That's really interesting.
Right. And then we have this other theory called dual neurological processing that was proposed back in the 60s.
Tell me more about that one.
So this theory, it was put forth by a guy named Robert Efron, and he suggested that maybe déjà vu happened because there's a tiny delay in how sensory information gets processed in the temporal lobe of the brain. The idea is that information from our senses goes into the temporal lobe twice, once through each hemisphere, and there's a little difference in timing between those two signals. So Efron thought that maybe sometimes those two signals aren't perfectly synced up, and that causes the brain to process the same event as two separate experiences. And that second experience feels like a replay of the first. It's like a tiny echo.
So it's like a tiny echo in the brain.
Yeah, kind of. And of course, we can't talk about all these feelings of familiarity without mentioning dreams about it.
You're right. I've heard a lot of people say that their déjà vu experiences feel like something they've dreamt before.
Yeah, that's a common one. There are a few different thoughts about how dreams might be connected to déjà vu. Some research suggests that a good chunk of déjà vu moments actually do mirror situations or places that we've dreamt about. Some people even say they've had the feeling of déjà vu while they were dreaming. And then there's the idea of precognitive dreams.
Precognitive dreams. That's getting into some pretty out there territory.
It is. Basically, it's the belief that some déjà vu experiences are actually memories of dreams that somehow predicted a future event.
Interesting idea.
Yeah, but there's not really any strong scientific evidence to back it up. It's more of a belief that some people have. And then there's Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious.
Oh, yeah. The collective unconscious. What's that all about?
So Jung believed that all humans share this kind of inherited universal pool of knowledge and archetype. And he thought that maybe sometimes a situation or a place could resonate with these deep universal patterns, and that triggers a feeling of recognition that we experience as déjà vu. Even though it's not based on any personal memory, it's a pretty metaphorical explanation, and it's hard to test scientifically, but it's definitely part of the conversation about déjà vu.
Wow, that's a lot of different possibilities, from these tiny brain blips to forgotten dreams to these big philosophical ideas. It's no wonder déjà vu is still such a mystery. You mentioned earlier that some people seem to experience déjà vu more often than others. What kinds of people are we talking about?
So research has found that people who report more frequent déjà vu tend to have some things in common. They tend to be more educated, have higher incomes, travel a lot, remember their dreams well, identify as politically liberal, and be younger adults, especially between the ages of 15 and 25.
That's an interesting mix of characteristics. Maybe it has something to do with having a wider range of experiences, or maybe younger people just remember their dreams more vividly.
Those are definitely good guesses. Researchers are still trying to figure out exactly why these groups have more déjà vu. Now, we've been talking about déjà vu as this pretty common and usually harmless thing, but there are times when it could be a sign of something more serious.
Right. That's important to note. Like, if it's happening all the time or if there are other symptoms along with it, it could be a red flag.
Exactly. If you have déjà vu once in a while and you're otherwise healthy, it's probably nothing to worry about. But if you're getting it a lot, especially multiple times a week or more, it could sometimes be a sign of temporal lobe epilepsy.
Oh, so it could be a type of seizure.
Yeah, a type of seizure called a focal onset aware seizure, which used to be called a simple partial seizure. That's the type that's most often linked to déjà vu.
And what are some of the other things that might happen during a seizure like that?
Well, along with that déjà vu feeling, someone might kind of zone out and not be aware of what's going on around them. They might start shaking or having convulsions. They might bite their tongue, lose control of their bladder, and be confused for a bit right after the seizure. So it's important to pay attention to any of those symptoms if you have déjà vu.
Right. So it's not just about the déjà vu itself, but about what other things are happening at the same time. Are there any specific things people should watch out for, like any red flag?
Yeah, definitely. If you're having déjà vu a lot, like several times a week or even a few times a month, that's a red flag, especially if you ever lose consciousness during those hours, even for a short time. Also, if the déjà vu always comes with really strange, vivid, or dreamlike memories or visuals, that's something to pay attention to. Other red flags would be things like chewing movements or fumbling with your hands without meaning to, your heart suddenly racing, or feeling really scared for no reason. Basically, if you're at all unsure about what's causing your déjà vu, it's always a good idea to talk to your doctor or a neurologist checked out.
That's great advice. It's always better to be safe than sorry, especially when it comes to your brain. So as we wrap up our deep dive into déjà vu, what are the main takeaways you want listeners to remember?
Well, first off, remember that déjà vu is a totally normal human experience. Most people will have it at some. Second, from what we know now, it probably has something to do with how our memories work, but we're still figuring out exactly how. There are all these different theories, from little brain glitches to recalling similar but forgotten experience. And it's also possible that there are some neurological things going on, especially if you're having déjà vu a lot. Lastly, if you only have déjà vu every now and then, you're probably fine. But if it's happening frequently, or if you're having other weird symptoms along with it, it's worth getting checked out by a doctor.
That's a good summary. I feel like this deep dive has really shed some light on what can be a really weird and sometimes unsettling feeling.
Glad to hear it.
It's definitely helped me understand it better, and hopefully it's done the same for everyone listening.
That was the goal, to take all the interesting things you sent me and turn them into something that makes sense without getting too technical.
So here's a final thought for everyone listening. We talked about all these different explanations, from brain glitches to echoes of dreams to these bigger, more philosophical ideas. So what does this strange feeling of déjà vu tell us about how we perceive things, how reliable our memories are, and maybe even what it means to experience reality? Is it just a quirk of the brain, a little trick it plays on us? Or could there be something deeper, more meaningful to this weird feeling that so many of us have? It's definitely something to think of. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into déjà vu.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.